We're in Exodus, and part of the reason for studying Exodus is our youth will be studying Exodus for Lads to Leader Bible Bowl material, and frankly, it is a great study. Tonight, we're going to kind of review some things from chapter 1 and look at chapter 2. And as I mentioned this morning at the very close, chapters 1 and chapters 2, you kind of read that and think, okay, the Israelites, and they multiplied. And Pharaoh didn't like that. And so Pharaoh oppresses them, makes life very hard. And then he even makes it worse because he wants the midwives to have these baby boys killed. And that doesn't even work. And then you get to the very end and he wants these Hebrews, the boys, cast into the Nile. That's a quick way of summarizing chapter 1. And in that, frankly, you're thinking Israelites, Pharaoh, well, kind of midwives too. But if that's all you think, you miss what all this is about. Once you get to chapter 2, you may be thinking, okay, there's Amram and Jochebed, and they have Moses. And then they put him in that little basket and place him among the reeds in the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him. And then Miriam, his sister, she's watching, and when Pharaoh's daughter finds him, she says, well, you need somebody to be a nurse for that child. And so then Pharaoh hires Moses' mama to nurse that child. And she takes him until he's weaned, and then she goes back to Pharaoh's daughter. But once again, if all you're seeing here is Moses and Pharaoh's daughter, you're really missing it. After that, you have Moses becoming an adult. And he sees this taskmaster mistreating these Hebrews. And he looks, kind of like he looks both ways. He doesn't see anybody. And he kills that taskmaster. Next day he's out, and here two Hebrews are arguing amongst themselves. And he tries to kind of be the peacemaker. Doesn't work. And he finds out. They know he's killed the Egyptian. Well, if they know, it won't be long until the Egyptians know, and even Pharaoh knows. Killing that taskmaster, not only was it murder, it basically was treason as well. And so he flees to Midian. And then as you come towards the close of the book, he marries and has children. Now realize that a lot has happened in these 2 chapters. But once again, if all you see towards the end of this is Moses an adult, killing the Egyptian, and then going to Midian, marrying, and having children, you're missing the point. I would suggest the entire point of Exodus chapters 1 and 2 is God. God is written every verse. The providence of God, the plans of God, the workings of God. It's all there. You see, as you go back to Abraham was made a promise of a great nation. And, well, Abraham didn't see the great nation. He had, you recall, Ishmael. That wasn't God's plan. Then there was Isaac, who was the son of promise. And then when his wife Sarah dies, he marries Keturah and has other children. But Isaac's that son of promise. Then Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Once again, even Isaac doesn't see the nation. Jacob's that line of sons of promise, if you would. And to him, with 2 wives and 2 handmaids, were born 12 sons. And that's where we come with the 12 tribes of Israel. Although, admittedly, there's a little tweaking in there, as you have Ephraim and Manasseh instead of Joseph, and then the Levi tribe doesn't itself get a land inheritance. We speak of them the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's when we get to the point of nation, nation, nation. Abraham didn't see it. Isaac didn't see it. Jacob himself didn't see it. Now Jacob, though, as you get towards the end of the book of Genesis, he's taken all of his family during that famine period to Egypt. And you see once again, back in Genesis 15:13, Abraham had been told that his descendants would spend 400 years in a land that was not theirs. And if we were to step back and say, why? To me, the reason probably is somewhat evident. It's not spelled out so much, but they were basically in that land that one day would become theirs. These people were very evil. Even Esau himself had married of the people of that land, vexing his mother. And how are we going to, as it were, keep them separate? Separate from all of these other folks, separate from their sins, separate from their evils, separate from their idols. Going down to Egypt, they went to the land of Goshen. And there they lived separate from the Egyptians. By the way, that may have been one of the things the Egyptians didn't care so much for. They did not assimilate into the Egyptian culture. They stayed separate. But it was during this period of time that God blessed them. And so in chapter 1 you have the word, they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong in verse 7. Then you have in verse 10 the word multiply, indicating that the Egyptians had seen. They've multiplied. And then in verse 12, the more they multiplied. And then when you get down to verse 20, God dealt with the midwives and the people multiplied and grew very strong. This 70 or 75, exactly how you're counting it, grew to be truly a nation within the nation of Egypt. This 400 years that God had said you would be in a land that's not yours. It's happened. God's plan, God's providence. But of course, within this story in chapter 1, there arose a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. He didn't know the fact that Joseph had interpreted the dream and then actually led the nation to prepare for the 7 years of famine during the 7 years of plenty. You get right down to it, Joseph was an Egyptian national hero, but now he's forgotten. And the fact that this Hebrew nation is from Joseph's people matters not. In fact, there's almost fearful of the Hebrews. A foreign nation comes and attacks, they'll join with them. The Hebrews themselves, some suggest that they had not been trained as soldiers and didn't have weapons. I'm not sure you'd find that so much within Scripture. But yet you could see if they joined with an invading army, it would be a formidable force. So the way that Pharaoh deals with this is he makes life hard. Basically turns them into slaves. Sets hard taskmasters before them. In fact, it's so bad that you read in verse 11 that he afflicted them with heavy burdens. You read in verse 13 that he ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. And then in verse 14, made their lives bitter with hard service. And then at the end of verse 14, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So life very hard for the Hebrews. That's not enough. Because you see, God kept blessing them and they multiplied. And so that's when he told the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and said to them, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, see them on the birth stool, if it's a son, you shall kill him. Now sometimes people say, were these midwives Hebrews or were they Egyptians? Well, my understanding is that the grammar could be either way. They were Hebrews who were midwives, or they were midwives who happened to be midwives for the Hebrews. There's some things within this that kind of makes me think maybe they were Egyptians, but nevertheless had learned enough and knew enough about God and the way He had blessed the Hebrews that they didn't want to cross the God of the Israelites. And so they let these baby boys live. When Pharaoh begins to inquire about it, they answer that, well, these women are lively. They're strong. They give birth quickly. And so by the time we get there, they've already given birth. Well, the fact that they don't kill these baby boys, God blesses these midwives. And once again, the Israelites, they grow strong and they multiply. And so he hatches another plan. He says, this is the last verse of chapter 1. Every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, sometimes people have said, why kill the sons and not the women? Well, some suggestions, and it's just suggestions. Well, the men, they could grow up to be soldiers, not so much the women. And possibly, if there's not men around, maybe the women would then marry amongst the Egyptians and they would assimilate into the Egyptian culture. That's just some suggestions. Doesn't really say why, except kill the boys, keep the girls alive. And now chapter 2. There's a Levite, married to a Levite. It doesn't name them here, but later in Exodus chapter 6, verse 20, you find that the man is Amram and the woman is Jochebed. And they become the parents of Moses. It's interesting how he's described. In verse 2, he's called, in the English Standard Translation, a fine child. In Acts chapter 7, verse 20, now what's Acts got to do with this? In Acts chapter 7 is Stephen's sermon, which is one of the best Old Testament summaries you're going to find anywhere, biblical or non-biblical. And it makes mention that Moses was beautiful in God's sight. And then in Hebrews, even there he's called beautiful. That's got to have been one pretty baby. For all those folks who think nobody's baby's pretty, I think they'd say, okay, he was. And let's put it this way, when God said it, it was a pretty baby. So how is she going to protect him? Well, what she does is she takes this basket. Now the word used is ark, which is actually the same word used in Genesis chapter 6 for the ark that Noah built. But I think you could know that they were somewhat different in size. Noah's ark as long as a football field and a half, this being small enough for a child. So translated here, basket. And then it was dabbed with bitumen and pitch. So in other words, they made it waterproof. And so then the baby could go in there and they placed it among the reeds in the Nile. When I was a little boy, I don't know, I had some notion that they just stuck him in the Nile and he was just floating down the river. Well, that wasn't exactly the way it happened. He was among the reeds by the riverbank, as you find in verse 3. And then Pharaoh's daughter, who had gone down there to bathe, she hears the child crying in verse 6. I want to ask you something. I can't find it. Can you find me another place in Genesis to Revelation that mentions a baby crying? I couldn't find it. I'm wondering, is this the only place that a baby cries in Scripture? Babies cry a lot. Apparently not in the Bible. But Moses is crying. Pharaoh's daughter hears it. And so she finds the baby, and she has compassion and care for the child. Now, as I'd mentioned, this is God written all over this. Because not only how are we going to turn Abraham's seed into a great nation, how are we going to keep them separate and God-fearing and God-loving and God-obeying people when there's idolatry and wickedness all around them? And how are we going to then get them back to Canaan after they've been 400 years in a land that they do not own? You see, this is God's hand written all over this. even yes, Moses in this basket of bulrushes, God's hand's all over it. And if somebody says, Steve, what do you mean by this? God's hand's all over it. We find in Hebrews 11:23, by faith, Moses was hidden. Wouldn't this have to be the faith of Amram and Jochebed, father and mother of Moses? By faith, yes, God's hand is all over this. And then to realize, okay, there Miriam is, Moses' older sister, and she runs to Pharaoh's daughter, who's rescued baby Moses, and asks if she needs someone to nurse the child. That's verse 7. And then, and I find this just almost fascinating, Moses' mother is hired and paid to nurse and rear him until he's weaned. Now, if somebody were to say, well, how long was this? You know, it doesn't say. It doesn't say. I think it's generally thought, and I think with good reason, that women in that day tended to nurse their children longer than possibly women today. And it wasn't like they could go to the Walmart or Publix and buy formula. And so there would be a tendency to nurse them longer, and sometimes you think in terms of maybe about 3 years. Have you been around a little baby? Have you been around a little child and begin to see how quickly they learn and how they pick up on things? How that they begin to repeat things? And now think about this for a moment. You're Jochebed. Your baby. You are so thrilled that not only is he alive, but it's almost like you've got the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. She's hiring you to take care of her own child. But you know that you're not going to be able to keep him. What are you going to do? Say you got 3 years. What are you going to do? You're going to cram every moment of love, every moment of education and teaching, every moment of know who you are and and what your heritage is into that 3 years. I could just imagine that he was taught like no child has ever been, maybe before or after. She knew her time was going to be limited. And so then verse 10 it says, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter to become her son. How much contact did Jochebed have with Moses after this point? I think it would be very difficult for anyone to say with any exactness at all. But now what did happen as he was a son of Pharaoh's daughter? You know, as I mentioned, Stephen in Acts has some things to say about this. And in Acts 7:22, he says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and became mighty in his words and works. Now, okay, you know how the story ends because you know a little bit further into Exodus about what happens. He is God's deliverer. He's going to return and say to Pharaoh, let my people go. Can you see how God is preparing him for this? From the training he had from his mother, and then even from being in Pharaoh's house and receiving the education among the Egyptians. And in fact, excelling in this, becoming mighty in his words and works. God's hands in this. God's planning on the deliverance of His people. And now He's preparing Moses to be that deliverer. And you see, once again, God's hand all over this. Now, as you get down to verse 10 and 11, you realize you go from him being returned to Pharaoh's daughter to verse 11, when Moses had grown up. Now, right here, we are not told about, well, how old he likely would have been. But once again, going back to Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, we find that he would be about 40 years old. So think in terms of he has spent the much better part of the 40 years as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Those very early years, maybe 3, who knows exactly how many, as the son of Jochebed, his true mother. But I find it interesting, he jumps from child to an adult. What's taking place? God's preparing him to be that leader. And that's when in verse 11, he goes out and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And then in verse 12, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. You know, the way this reads to me, it seems apparent that when he said sees no one, I don't even think he's even seeing the Hebrew that the Egyptian had been beating. In other words, the Hebrew, this Egyptian is all alone. And Moses is all alone with him. Can I say this? So he thinks. He looked this way and that. Okay. When you're going to cross the street, you look this way, you look that way. If you're going to do something you don't want anybody to know about, you might look this way and that way. But I'm going to tell you something. If you're going to do something that you don't want anybody to know about, you got to look this way and that way. You probably better not do it. Most of the time, it means we're bent on doing something wrong, something bad. But there's a lesson to be learned here. He was careful. He looked this way, looked that way. He sees no one. He kills the Egyptian. Then in verse 13, on the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? He thought no one saw. Somebody saw. And not only did somebody see, but it has been apparently murmured around the Egyptians, around the Hebrews, that now this man knows about it. And of course, it's very apparent that if all the Hebrews know, it's just a matter of time before the Egyptians know. What he did is already mentioned. It would be both murder and treason, insurrection. In other words, his life would be in danger. So it says, Moses fled. Verse 15. Pharaoh heard of it, sought to kill him, so Moses fled. Now this was by faith, Hebrews 11:27. So once again, we say that you got to see God in all of this. Not just the story at face value, but see God behind the scenes. If somebody say, what's happening with God and Moses here? Just as God had prepared Moses to become a leader that could go before Pharaoh, knowing the Egyptian ways, knowing their language well, See, now for the next 40 years, he's going to spend it in an area where eventually he will be taking the Israelites. And yes, it was another 40 years. Think about this for a minute. The task at hand is Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. That's what's to happen. But God lets Moses spend 80 years in preparation for this to happen. Then we read that he goes down to Midian and is among the Midianites. Now I know that it's easy to read through this without seeing the significance. But the Midianites would have actually been descendants of Abraham through Keturah. So there's that little bit of a connection. We find that Reuel or Jethro then becomes his father-in-law as he rescues, you might say rescues, the father's daughters from hoodlums as they are watering their flocks. Now here's an interesting thing in verse 19. They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." I wrote down here, how did they know he was an Egyptian? And the reality was he was Hebrew. They said an Egyptian. Speculation, the way he was dressed, maybe his speech. But it shows how God had been preparing him. Well, he comes to wed Zipporah, verse 21. She gave birth to a son, Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Now all of this is more so facts about the people. But I've tried to say, see God behind all of this. And then finally, as you get the very last paragraph of chapter 2, listen to what it says. "During those days, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Yes, God's there. But really, God's been there the whole time. And I hope that as you think about chapters 1 and 2 of Exodus, and you see this story unfold, I hope that you see the faith of these people, whether it's even these midwives for the Hebrews, or whether it's Amram and Jochebed, or whether it's Moses himself as he came to a point that he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Yes, you see these people faithful to God, but more than that, you see God working out His plan to deliver the Hebrews from the Egyptians and to make the ultimate good on the promise that He had made to Abraham. "I'm going to make of you a great nation, and I'm going to give you a land." And now God's preparing Moses so he can make good on that promise. I realize that how our lives unfold, sometimes people might see, well, I'm not sure about providence. Well, providence is one thing that, without a "thus saith the Lord," without a book, chapter, and verse, we can't know for certain about a lot of things. But I think here you can see the providence of God working, can't you? And seeing that, I'm not sure that all of those people understood that and saw that as it was happening. You know, we kind of got to step back and we're looking at the whole picture. They're living the picture day by day. But can't you see the providence of God? God working. And that should give us greater love, appreciation, should give us hope, should give us assurance in God and His promises. If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, if it's someone who with faith has turned from their sin and wants to confess that faith and be baptized, we'd be glad to assist you. If there's a need for prayer, we'd be glad to pray for you. If you need to come, please come as we stand and sing.